And then I want to kind of just demonstrate something, and then I think I want to see if we can talk a little bit about JavaScript classes because I'm starting to explore those. So this is something I built as a proof of concept for a client. They want something built in FileMaker and a web viewer, and it is it's a I don't know, it's an order review system, yes. So they have when we load into the web viewer, we have a bunch of orders that are actually going to be vertical on the left side. And then clicking on one of them will show the details. So it's basically a list detail kind of view. But they want it in a web viewer because they're styling and um, it's just, it's just, I don't know. Actually, now that I think about it, like, why are we putting it in a web viewer? They have it I think they have it in FileMaker tables and stuff, but I don't know, they want it in a web viewer. So I proposed a price to them. We'll see if they get back to me. But it was just another chance for me to explore how to use buttons to fetch data into. So here's my list, here's my detail. All the data is coming from this field, this table right here. And it's just a matter of me loading the first initial possible records into the web viewer. I worked hard to get a nice skeleton available or view here, and then just using whatever techniques I knew to fetch the data from FileMaker. So every time I press a button, it's going to run a script to go fetch the data and send it back to the web viewer and put it in the right spot. What I love about this is you can kind of see that when I first load it, we see the skeleton. Whenever I click on something, I can barely see a loading skeleton. It's really fast. But then after I've loaded it one time, I don't get any more loading issues. It's still going to run the script that goes and fetches the data. But the way that I've constructed this is if it doesn't see any changes between what it has stored in the cache of the web viewer and what is returned back, then it just uses what's stored. It doesn't actually try to reload it or anything. I don't know. So it was an interesting thing. I needed to know that I could build this to fetch the data properly from buttons and so forth. So I'll just show you. I'm using React, so it's a little bit more complex than just this. But I'm basically here's my whole structure. I'm sending in buttons in the first place. Those are just the records here, the colors, and I'm plotting those. I'm rendering those in a space and just making one button per color. I built some active functionality in it so that it looks different when it's active. But what happens is when we click on it, it runs a function called. So this is a little bit more complex. I'm using a library called React Query that goes and it handles the fetching of the data. My React Query structure is this right here, and it is running a function that I wrote that uses FM Gopher to perform this. We've talked about FM Gopher a lot here in the community, but I'm using it again to go fetch the data because it does it asynchronously. So this whole structure will say, I'm going to go fetch the data, and I'm going to wait for the data to return before I send it back to the main area and then render the data. So that's what's doing here. This is the basic script that we're running the perform script on. And then this little object here, this little function here is what's actually doing all the work. All of this is doing some weird stuff that I don't fully understand. I just know that I can implement it and it will run this function for me. And like I said, it will check, it will say, all right, I'm going to go run this function. But if what I have stored in the cache is not different, then I'm just going to show what's in the cache because I don't want to have to re-render it or cause a delay or something. So I don't know. This was a fun thing to put together. I enjoy the process, and I think I've been thinking about it. I think it's a very good way for us to work with data in a web viewer and allow it to change. In lots of other instances, I teach people to tap into the library's API. So, like in a chart, you can add data to it or in a table, you can add rows to the table because the library itself has an API that lets us stick new data in. Here, I don't have that, so I'm having to generate that itself. And luckily it's React, so React can handle data changes. But it's a more advanced way, and I think it's something that we need to push ourselves to use more and more.
Jeremy, can I ask you
Yeah.
about your state management there? You're using React Query. Is React Query a state management library, or is it more just a fetching like, okay, it is. So
No,
when would
wait,
you
hold on.
use, is
I
it
don't
is it
think
equivalent to Redux, or would you use it and Redux in the same project?
I've never used.
Redux? What about use context? Have you used that?
Yes. React Query is a server state library responsible for managing asynchronous. It is not. I think they don't like it. Redux is client side that can be used in asynchronous state. I think.
So Redux prevents the data prop drilling, right? You can just state it, and then any component can grab the state. It doesn't need to be passed down from parent to child. Whereas so when I was chatting with ChatGPT at one point, it said you should use React Query in this situation, not Redux. And I was like, really? Don't I need still a global state management?
So React Query it's not a data fetching library. It is a state manager. Yeah.
It is a state management. Okay.
Yeah. So it manages the state of the data. So this is more complex, but I think it's worth exploring as FileMaker developers how to get data into something that you specifically created. Like I created this component myself. I didn't use a library to render it. All libraries have ways to push new data in and replace what was there. Um, and I think that's a good mechanism. And so I wanted to ask you all a couple questions. First of all, hi, Doug. Hi, Sam. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Do you, I'll start with Brad because I know you use it a lot. When you use the web viewer to render something, are you leaving it that pretty static or are you continually trying to put new data into it?
In most cases, I mean, a lot of the data table stuff is static, but there's a few situations where I'm constantly trying to update the data and that kind of stuff. So not the majority, but some of them.
Like, are you using a table, use data tables and then using that library's API to do so?
I'm trying to think specifically about the one I was working on the other day. I'm not sure if that's data tables or if that's just all JavaScript that I wrote. But I think it's data tables on the back end, yeah.
Okay. So you might
And
be
like you
using,
said, just calling, like I'll have a script, either a script on timer from FileMaker or a script, yeah, or I'll have the web viewer itself trigger to tell FileMaker to go call and then push it back in.
okay. How about you, Doug? When you create something, are you leaving it fairly static or are you trying to update it with new data, refreshing it once in a while?
It depends on the component. So like if it's historical information like sales data, stuff like that, I just pull it and the data is in such a shape by the time it gets into the JavaScript object, that it's really not a big deal to process it. So it's a it's a call for fresh data. But in some of the like historical, if I do like a trailing 12-month type of a situation where I'm showing more data, what I do is I run that as a process on the server, and I look for the last time that that data was updated, and if it's the same day, then well, is it same day? I use some kind of criteria to match now against when it was last created, and so it may not be the last up to the minute data, but it's relevant for the data set that I'm looking at, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Um, and then uh, the other way that I use it that's not sales data and charting and stuff, where it's actually data tables data, I again have two different types of scenarios. One where I load like 100,000 customer records in it, and I do that on a batch. Because if I do that, even that query takes about a minute and 50 seconds, a minute and 40 seconds. So I run that in a batch, store it as a global variable or a global field, and then I give the customer the ability to update that information if they want to see it fresh with a button that runs update on server with callback.
Okay.
And then so they can go on about their merry way, and then it updates and they get a notification that it's updated, and they can go in there and it rewrites it back to that global.
Okay.
And then the smaller bits of information that I filter, I'm looking at like a daily schedule or accounts receivable for a specific time frame, or I have basically a data tables that goes and it looks at any record that was touched that day. And those are live. Yeah, those are live queries.
Okay.
So kind of a mix, it would be nice if I did implement the Gopher
Mhm.
implementation into some of those scenarios, because it would be more efficient, and it would preclude the need to run scripts on server periodically. But that's my caveman way of doing it.
Right. And the
That
purpose of
works.
this, so normally what I would have done is I would have just gone to this table, this table, and just loaded everything into the web viewer. That's a legitimate way to do it. And I've done it many times where I take these 8 records and I load the choice, the primary key, and the details. What I'm choosing to do, because my actual project will be more complicated, I have to fetch from different tables, is when I first load, the only thing that I'm loading into the web viewer is get data. The only thing I'm loading is an array of objects, and the only thing that the object contains is the primary key and the choice. I purposely left the details out because I don't want to load it all in there. I want to load just what I need in there, and then I want to use this mechanism to go fetch this record. Yeah, it's overkill for this, but if I were having to fetch, when I click a button, if I were having to fetch from 6 different, it would be so much easier just to load these in there. And then when this button is pressed, go fetch the data from all 6 of those tables, package it up, and then stick it in there. Because that's the only data that I really need, right?
Or whatever slice you're looking at, right? You could dice that up and say primary key and then last edit or something like that with a minimal amount of information, and then pull it in based on some filtering mechanism.
Yeah, I've done that. I'm kind of in the moment, I'm anti-filtering inside of the client, inside of the JavaScript, because
Oh,
I do have a mechanism to, when I click on a button, to pass the ID of that button, and then the fetcher function uses the ID to go fetch the actual data. So I think there's no bad ways to do it except for what you mentioned. Using execute data API script step on the server returns truncated data if you have lots of data. So in this case, I'm just sending 8 things in initially, and then I'm only fetching the exact data that I need when they press a button or a row or something.
so in the case of like my customer table where I've got, 80 or 100,000 records, and even though you've grabbed the key, the primary key, you still have to go back and get the record data that you're
Yeah.
pulling down. That's still going to take some time, right?
Yes, but it's
The
breaking
first time, but then once you have it, then it's going to monitor state
Mhm.
to see if there's any new data, right?
Yes. How about you?
It does kind of depend how you fetch it, and that's partly to do with the way FileMaker, where if you fetch just the primary key from a field, the server will send you the whole record because it has to. Like you kind of have to be aware of these things. The hitting the layout and loading all the records in that table is a way to start, and it works with like 10, 100 records. But as you say, when you get to like a 80, 100,000 or millions of records, you definitely need to be very proactive to say, right, well, get me the first 50 or 25, and then there's a link for more, or you're getting all of those, or actually you've got those keys are in a different table because you're then not sending the whole record with every single one. And as your solution starts to scale, it definitely, you have to think about that strategically more, about not just loading everything straight away.
Yeah, and in my particular scenario where with the customer data, I have all of it because what functionally I'm doing is searching the whole database across a number of fields for a text string. It's like the global find that you have in that's built into FileMaker. But this is really, really good because each time you hit a key, it shows you a filtered result, and that's customer loves that.
And what's cool about this query method that I'm doing is that it allows me, it has a function to refetch the data, and I can tell it every 3 seconds or every 10 seconds or whatever, I want you to fetch the data. And so I can be looking at the orange color, this data, this detail, and someone can update it over here. And within 3 seconds, this is going to have refreshed. It's handling this re-rendering of this data on its own. I'm not having to worry about it. I'm not having to do any
And
comparisons.
that's not going to type. That's not going to type that interface. It's not
It's not going to tie up
it's
this interface, especially if someone else is doing it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's cool. Oh, well, that's cool.
But then if you have 200 customers and they're all sat on that layout and they're all requesting the server every 3 seconds, aren't they? It depends on the use case, doesn't it? If you have something that's
Yeah.
constantly polling, is different from having a way
Listen.
to not have to request that record every so often. And obviously FileMaker will do some clever stuff so that it has a cache of records it looked at recently, so it shouldn't be round tripping to the server, but at some point it will. And then when 100 customers order that at once is when the performance then starts to become a problem.
Yep. I mean, that could be a downside if all of us or 200 people were on this layout. I mean, that's just 200 scripts running every 3 seconds. It's just a script running every 3 seconds on everybody's instance of this layout. And, the server could protest, like you said, but it is a nice way to allow me to stay here and just see the data coming in and the changes. And I appreciate that. I think that that's a good experience. I've never tested this with the high amounts of users. I don't know what that would do. So that's an interesting experiment. But this is how websites work, as far as I understand, is you can build a website to go fetch data from the source, from an API or something. And if something changes, then it gets re-rendered on the user screen. FileMaker server probably is not like other web servers in that it maybe can't handle 200 people on the same layout running a script every 3 seconds. I don't know. So,
But in the web world, that's where you'd be talking about edge servers, where you're like, if you're
yeah,
looking at your Amazon page and you're looking at your list of orders and stuff like that, your page isn't querying the big database in, in the data center in California somewhere. It's
yep,
Replication. Yeah.
yeah, there's a whole layer of caching in between there where you then it keeps track. It's like the way React works. It keeps track of what you're looking at, so that when any of that data changes, it knows to redraw that data, which is different from periodically saying, has this data changed? Has this data changed? Has this data changed? It's saying, you've got 1, 2, and 3. I'll keep track of it. You've got 1, 2, and 3. If those change, I'll send you now 3 is now banana. So it's a different way of propagating out the changes, polling versus tracking what is kind of what records are being viewed, is open in a sense.
Yeah, and then writing conflicts are a whole nother ball of wax.
Mm.
So, yeah.
So you got people looking at the same piece of data in a web application like that, and both are editing the same information. You've got.
I think it's
kind of separate.
I think it needs to be explored more. I think FileMaker developers need to know that you can take the web viewer to the next level and say, not only am I going to render something, but I'm going to update it as often as I need to update it, whether it's through a manual button or it's through a process that's running, in this case, every 3 seconds. I think that it's worth exploring that more, because I think it brings more flexibility. There's probably some downsides to it, but I don't know anybody that's using a web viewer to fetch data with 200 users looking at the same record. So the same layout. So I couldn't tell you what those downsides are, except for, stuff that we've brought up here. So,
Well, the one thing that I have noticed with my stuff in particular is that as FileMaker has evolved, the caching has gotten much, much better. And so, like in your example here, once you click on something and then you go back to it, I kind of have the same thing. I have a layout with about 8 tabs on it. And the first time I load it, it takes maybe a second and a half. But if I go to another tab, load fresh data, and then go back to it where it's still making the same query, FileMaker's already cached a lot of that information and it draws it almost immediately.
yep.
So FileMaker's doing some of that stuff behind the scenes, which is really cool.
In this case, the web viewer is doing that because that's what web viewers do. That's what browsers do, is they cache the data somewhere. And so, yeah, you're not seeing the flicker of the skeleton as I click on buttons that I've already clicked on. Slate, you see a slight change, but none of the other ones. So, anyway.
But then if you were to go to another record and come back, it's still only state in the view of that web viewer, isn't it? Because FileMaker still remembers what that web viewer last saw, and that web viewer has already loaded those bits of data in, doesn't it? And then at some point that gets kicked out of the cache because various reasons why it can fall off the cache, isn't it? But that's kind of the nice thing about the way FileMaker treats the cache of that web viewer. It will hold on to it for a certain amount of time.
That's an interesting view. So let's try something. So I'm in development mode, so it's refetching every 3 seconds. I click on orange and I go to the next record. Over here in orange, I make a change. Now, in what you just said, the web viewer would have remained static and those exclamation points wouldn't have shown. But because I added them and I have the every 3 seconds refetching, it got updated as I went back to it. So I think that's a nice aspect of the web viewer is I can update it. It doesn't have to be static. So, and when you as far as when you're going between records. So anyway,